I am so excited to welcome Dr. Martina Dove to the program today. Martina earned her PhD from University of Portsmouth in the UK, where she developed the first measure of susceptibility to fraud. She literally wrote the book on this, The Psychology of Fraud, Persuasion, and Scam Techniques. Her research focuses on understanding what makes people vulnerable to scams and the persuasion techniques that fraudsters use. I reached out to her because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't crazy. She studied scams for a lot longer than I have. So she graciously accepted my invitation to come on the program. Martina, welcome. I am so glad you're here. I've read some articles that you contributed to, some podcasts that you've been on, but I have to be honest, I have not had time to read your book, although I do have it on order. For those who are less familiar with your work, can you tell me what brought you to the world of scams? What interested you about that, and how people get vulnerable to scams?
Yeah, I actually discovered scams kind of by accident, I would say. I wanted to do a PhD on cognitive biases, and one cognitive bias in particular called the Barnum effect. And the Barnum effect is a very, very cool thing where people will accept, if you give people, let's say, a personality test, and then give them some feedback that you made up, they're going to accept that, especially if the feedback is very neutral and vague and could apply to anybody in population. It's going to appear very, very trustworthy and very credible. So people accept that feedback, and that's how psychic scams work. Right? The psychic will give you something very vague, such as like, hey, sometimes you can be really shy, but at other times you're like more outgoing. That could be anybody, right?
Yeah.
So like after some sentences like that, they can tell you anything and you'll believe them. So I wanted to do something with that effect, that cognitive bias, the Barnum effect. And I didn't quite know how to apply it, where to apply it for, and how would I do an experiment that would tie to something that was like current problem, let's say, in a society. And then I read this really cool paper. It was on psychology behind phishing emails. So how scammers use psychology to persuade people when they send phishing emails. And I was like, wow, this is super cool. And it's not very well studied and it's not very known. And I ended up switching. Well, not switching. I still did something with the Barnum effect. I had an experiment with the Barnum effect. But I ended up really diving into scams at that point and interviewing lots of victims, doing 2 experiments, and developing that measure you mentioned.
Did you find it hard to find victims to talk to you?
Yes and no. There are some people that when they get defrauded, a lot of the times when it comes to personal fraud, they are bounced between organizations they try to report it to. So they may go to police. Police will say, oh, that's a civil matter, go somewhere else. They'll go somewhere else. Like a bank will say, oh, you need to report it to this organization. But at the end of the day, they don't really get justice. So you have people who try that route and get very sad and just shut down. And then you have other people who are angry and want to talk about it and want to tell anybody their story. So I had a lot of people there. I had some people that were more withdrawn and didn't really want to engage around that. And I did luckily end up talking to a couple of people like that too when I was doing my PhD, through friends of a friend of a friend. I know someone, being introduced to them. But I had a lot of people that just wanted to tell me their stories because they felt abused by the system as well as the scammer because they just didn't get the justice.
And that's still going on.
Yes.
So
yes, it's really difficult.
Yeah. You wrote your book in 2020, and that was right at the height of the pandemic. And so I was wondering, since that time, I heard that frauds increased in size and scope. What has changed since you wrote your book? Have their tactics changed? Are they staying the same? What are you seeing?
Yeah, actually, my second edition has just been released and it's updated with the newer scams and the newer techniques. Scammers are always coming up with new techniques. What I would say, the techniques that I've written about in my first book are still current. They're still being used, but the sophistication of execution has gone up. So, for example, whereas in 2020 and before then, the only scams that were using the grooming were, to some part, the romance scams, in terms of you would be engaging in these conversations with a scammer and it wasn't just a one-off thing where somebody contacts you out of the blue. And then to some degree, there were like investment scams that did that. Since then, we've seen these pig butchering scams, which actually combine the two techniques, right? They combine some of the things that go into romance frauds and also the things that go into investment frauds to be a lot more effective and sinister. So what scammers are doing now in terms of that, they don't choose the route, right? Like it's not purely like romance, it's not purely investment. They will contact the victim and through the conversation figure out what the victim is more receptive to. So it's almost like choose your own adventure. And to do that, you have to have a script. You have to understand how that works. You have to be able to go down different avenues and adapt quickly. So what I've noticed that some of the scams that are cropping up are a lot more sophisticated in how they are executed. And it's not surprised because since then we've seen these scam compounds crop up and get built and humans are being trafficked to work and communicate with victims to build trust. So I think the operations have gotten a lot more sophisticated.
Did they have those compounds in 2020 when you were doing your book, or is that kind of a newer thing?
I don't actually know what year that started to happen, but in around 2022, I got contacted by a journalist from ProPublica who was investigating these scam operations that are cropping up. And he wanted me to analyze these conversations between victims and a scammer because he couldn't understand how are they doing it? How are they persuading people to just give so much money? So it's possible that even in 2020, there was some that we just didn't understand what was happening yet.
Yeah, I think people are still trying to figure it out. I still don't think it's anything mainstream that people understand yet. It's not gotten to the point of the Nigerian prince when you get the phone call and go send me money. It's so much more nuanced than that.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, we moved on from there.
Okay. You have stated that scams have nothing to do with intelligence. Can you expand on that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I think despite the social stigma, which I think, when I was doing my PhD, had an experiment that has proven that people who think that only gullible people fall for scam are actually more vulnerable because you become a little bit less careful, right? Because you think it wouldn't happen to you. But scams don't really have anything to do with intelligence. It's more nuanced than that. People have personalities. I could be very intelligent, but very impulsive, and I'm going to probably not make optimal decisions. That's not to say that people who have, let's say, learning difficulties, so maybe they're not as good at making thought out decisions, something like that, they're obviously more vulnerable. So I'm not saying that doesn't play some kind of a part in it, but very smart people fall for scams because they're realistic, because they fulfill the need, because they come at a point in their life where the circumstances are such that they're receptive to that. Like, for example, if a job scam came your way when you had a good job, you wouldn't even look at it twice. But if you're out of work, suddenly you will consider it. So it's a lot of it has to do with your circumstances, where you are, your personality, the way you process information. What is the preference for information processing? Are you somebody who likes to think, or are you somebody who makes decisions quicker without looking at the facts or getting more information? Are you somebody who has a social network you can tap into to ask questions? All of these things are more influential than your IQ or any intelligence level that you have, I guess.
One thing I wanted also to ask you about is that why and how does the psychological manipulation bypass our normal defenses? Because I'm not just going to go give money to somebody that asks me for it. They have to trick me into it, which unfortunately happened. How do they do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time people think that victims would just ask for money and they just give it. When you're rational and when you're thinking about that, you have that use case that very rarely really happens. If scammers did that, very few people would actually just give money to a stranger. And I think the only way to really explain that is that there's an element of intense grooming that happens. And that grooming is you enter into these conversations and this person becomes your friend. And that goes on for days and several times a day. And you open up to each other and suddenly the trust is built. And a lot of the times, especially in a romance scams, the scammer will orchestrate some kind of an incident. Something happened to them. Maybe they are on a business deal is going bad. And by that time, you're invested in this relationship. So oftentimes, victim will just offer to help because you're helping a friend. And when you think about it, we all have this ingrained in us, right? We grew up being taught to help others, be kind, especially help your friends and family, right? You have that bond with friends and family. You help each other. You do this for each other. It's like mutual. And so I think a lot of the times people gloss over the grooming that goes into preparing the victim for that moment when that critical incident happens, when a victim will give it to people. Or, for example, if it's an investment scam, how victims are prepared to get to the point where they're comfortable investing certain amount of money as well. So whichever way, whether it's a romantic or investment kind of route that the scammer takes, there are playbooks by which they actually do things. And you need to also understand as well, and I tell this to people who think that just giving very simple advice, don't do this, just don't send money, right? Scams happen because they evoke something in us, either fear or strong emotion, or fear and strong emotions. So for example, like in romance scams, right? You're not only in love because the scammer has been building that future with you and you're picturing this and you're sharing lots of intimate details, the trust is being built. Suddenly, when this critical incident happened, they end up in hospital, they need money for medical surgery, or they may die. Maybe a doctor calls you because they involve other personas and all of this. So these are all orchestrated grooming techniques. And you're suddenly, not only you have strong feelings for this person, you're in a state of fear. What's going to happen if you don't want this to happen? And you see this over and over. They manipulate that emotional roller coaster that we are on, because when we are in that kind of strong state of emotional, whether it's love, excitement, fear, sexual desire, all of them, right? Like sometimes it's all of them together, right? Like you're not thinking clearly. You're just thinking, hey, this is my loved one. They're in trouble. I must help. There's no other way. You're not even thinking. And I remember speaking to several victims who, at that point, for example, a transfer doesn't go through because the bank intervenes or something like that. The fear is not about being scammed, because a bank will tell them, look, we think this is a scam transaction. And I've asked several victims, like, what did you think at that time? And were you worried that you might be scammed? And the victim would tell me, no, actually, I was more worried that my relationship is going to fall apart if I don't help him. So I think people don't realize that the reason why these scams work is because the scammer has laid a foundation on which they can build more and more manipulation. And for that to happen, that sometimes takes months of just conversation, getting the victim used to having that conversation, making them anxious when the scammer withdraws the access to them. And that usually happens before the critical incident as well. A lot of the times there'll be a period of hours that the victim is not able to contact the scammer, and they'll be really anxious. So all of these things happen on a very subliminal level, but have an effect on how you're going to act next. And so I think when people look at scams and they look at it very simplistically on the surface, sure, it looks like you've just given the money to someone, but no, you were manipulated. I often say to people, think about how people admit to crimes they never committed under police interrogation. It doesn't happen in the first hour. It happens after 3 days of interrogation with no sleep. It happens over many hours of somebody constantly asking you to repeat the facts, and you're worn out. So I think people just don't understand how sophisticated is that manipulation and what goes into that manipulation. Because when I interview victims, I see just how smart some of these steps are. In actually, if you think of each step doesn't actually do anything in a moment. Each step is like looking 5 steps ahead. it's laying the foundation for something that will come in the future. So it's preparing you, priming you for that.
They're playing chess, we're playing checkers.
Exactly.
And don't you think it's partly just because people, I mean, the general population, were predisposed to trust people. We're kind of brought up to trust. I don't know if that's the way it is now, but when I was growing up, that's the way it was. There was nobody to be afraid of, really. And, well, I grew up in a small town, so, what do I know?
Yeah, definitely people have varying levels of trust. But one interesting thing is that even people who are very, very non-trusting can be scammed. You can be very non-trusting, but not very vigilant, right? So you're not going to check facts and you'll still be scammed. When we talk about trust, people need to understand trust is needed on a day-to-day basis. When you purchase anything from any website and you give your credit card, you're not walking out with that purchase. So you're trusting that they're going to send something to you.
Yeah.
So I think people don't actually realize when they say, oh, this person was too trusting. How trusting are you using internet, buying something from an unknown seller on eBay, or like, how trusting are you? So I think a lot of the times people don't realize that trust is really a component of any cooperation, like any business deal. You have to trust. Like, you have to trust that your customer is gonna, like, when you invoice them, they're gonna pay the invoice. When you go and have a massage, you trust that that customer after the massage is not just gonna leave, it's gonna pay for that massage, right?
Yeah.
Like, we constantly have to trust. So rather than saying, oh, this person is too trusting, you need to see it from our trust is manipulated and exploited, right? Because that's what's happening.
Is there anybody safe? I guess certain people are safe from certain scams. Like, I was speaking to somebody yesterday who was in a cult for 11 years. I don't think that I could ever be wormed into a cult like that, just because I don't have that trust of that kind of organization. But on the other hand, she probably would never fall into the romance scam either. So I guess it's just whatever you're closest to. I mean, not everybody's going to fall into a romance scam, and I understand that. However, I think that anybody that's unmarried, looking for companionship, or not looking for companionship, that was me, or maybe who's not happily married, completely, totally in love, might be a victim of a romance scam. Do you agree with that?
Not necessarily. I think it really depends on many other factors, but there's a potential, right? Because if you're looking, if it's applicable to you, then there's a pathway to you, right? Whether you're going to accept the challenge or not, it's up to you. But one thing I want to just touch upon, the cult thing as well. I think as people, we need to believe that we control a lot more than we do, right? There's a cognitive bias called illusion of control, where people generally believe they can control a lot more than they can. And so nobody willingly just goes and joins a cult, right? It doesn't start like that. I think how it starts is very benign. Starts in an exploration of at some workshop or something that resonates with you. Then you do it again, then you do it again. And that's how they get you in. It's the same as the domestic abuse doesn't start with a horrific violence, starts with a comment about what you're wearing. It starts with then a control, a stronger comment about what you're wearing. Then it starts about whom are you talking to, who your friends are. It never starts with this end goal, right? It starts, it grooms you into somebody who would accept bigger and bolder things that the manipulator wants to do. So I think it's natural for us to think it would never happen to us until it does, because we also have to maintain a self-esteem, right? So if we thought of ourselves as these people who would be under the influence of some kind of manipulator, that is not a good picture. And so a lot of the time people don't realize, A, how good manipulators are, and B, that we all have these positive illusions about ourselves, because it's vital for our self-esteem, which is vital for our day-to-day life. Because if we felt bad about ourselves, that wouldn't be normal, right? That would be a horrible thing to have day-to-day about it and think that about yourself. So I think to your second point about anybody can be a victim of a romance scam, yes, anybody can be. If there's a pathway to you, you may cross paths with a scammer. And sure, you're going to be more interested perhaps if you are single and you're looking for a partner than you would be if you already have a partner. Having said that, I like to say there's a scam out there for anyone, right? Let's say I'm married. I'm not looking for romance fraud. Nobody's looking for romance fraud. I'm not looking for a relationship, right? I'm not looking for a relationship, but I may be scammed in other way, right? There may be a GoFundMe I give money to that it's fake or something like that. So I think people, we hear a very small subset of these scams, but I think charity scams are a big thing where people don't even realize they were scammed because you don't expect anything back, right? So you don't know, you just give them money. And a lot of the times you don't even know if this was a fake website, if they spoofed the website, if you sent it to the right person, if the person who was saying the ill is really ill. So I think the bigger picture is that I think it's complicated because it comes down to so many different things. It comes down to how good scammers are at manipulating, how good they are at targeting. What is your circumstance? You may be single but not looking for companionship. Or you may be single looking for companionship, but you're a little bit more rational and you don't want to move very quickly. No scammer will converse with you for 3 years and not get anything in return. Do you see what I mean? So it's really, really very unique to each person and what their personality is and how they fall in love and how open they are, how trusting they are, how impulsive they are, how quickly they want to move in a relationship, how good a scammer is at manipulating. Because I'm sure any woman dating or any man dating on a dating site has been approached by scammers. And there are scammers who rush things and then you see the warning signs, So how many of those have you warded off before a good scammer came your way?
Yeah. I think in my case, it was, as I recall, there was at least 3. And the first one I didn't realize was a scammer, but he wanted to prove who he was. And so he says, okay, here's my website. Go to my website and you can look at it. And when I looked at it, very deep in there somewhere was a picture of him and what must have been his wife and the 2 children. And so I asked him about that and never heard from him again. And so he hadn't done his homework, number one. But number 2, I didn't realize that probably was a scammer. I just thought he was a lying, cheat SOB. Yeah, they just come at you with, I like your profile. I'd like to get to know you. And it really seems innocent at first, but they've got to get their foot in the door somehow, I guess.
They do, yeah.
But one thing that bothers me is if I had been ripped off by Bernie Madoff, if I'd given him my life savings and he got away with it, why am I looked at differently if I get ripped off by him versus I get ripped off by somebody like my Pedro person, where I know that I'm going to be setting myself up for ridicule as soon as people hear the story and know more about it? Why do the romance scammers get such disrespect versus any other type of scam?
Yeah, I think it's a shame. I think there were victims of that pyramid scheme that were actually also blamed. But when you think about investments pay off or don't pay off, they are tied to high risks. And so sometimes perhaps like when you invest into something and it's a scam, like you've taken that risk and it could have been a legitimate thing and with just high risk stakes, almost like a bet, and you lost that money. Whereas in romance, I think there's that idea of somebody tricked you that they loved you or something like that. I don't really know what makes people have more sympathy, but if you think about that's kind of general of all crimes, that there are some crimes that get more sympathy than other crimes. For example, victims of sexual violence are often blamed for what happened to them versus if you were just attacked in the street randomly, just as the victim of a sexual violence was, right? But somebody just beat you up, like it would be like, okay, like that's random, right? But as soon as it's a sexual attack, there must be something that a victim has done to provoke that, either by what they were wearing or they were out on the street at 10 p.m. or something like that. I think there is that thing where I think our brains just want to find a reason. And our brains want to find the reason because to some degree we want to control what happens to us. So if we put a blame on a victim, then that also tells us it wouldn't happen to us because we're smarter than that. We would never do that. Kind of what you did with a cult, right? When you said, oh, I would never engage with a cult. No, you wouldn't willingly, right? So I think a lot of the times, I think there's that, it comes from that almost illusion of control that people have, that they could really control a lot more. And I think a romance fraud is one of those. We are all foolish in love. I think I heard long time ago, and it stuck with me. I don't know who said it, but I read this really beautiful quote, and it said, we tend to trip up in love because of the blindfold. But even if you have a friend who's in love with somebody that doesn't care about them, you'll be giving advice and you'll just like, how can that person see that this isn't a good relationship for them? And so maybe it's because of that we actually have that happen to us through our lives, whereas less people are defrauded in a pyramid scheme. But romance is part of our life and how we form relationships. And I don't know if that gives us more right to criticize.
Yeah, that's part of why people aren't coming out and telling their story, is because I know that I'm going to get the crap kicked out of me emotionally if I come out.
Yes.
But I had to say personally, I don't care about that anymore. It's got to be something where if I'm going to come out, I've got to at least try and help other people come out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
is true.
And the other thing that kind of bugs me is that I know that I was listening to a podcast that you did with Kelly Paxton a few years ago, and you guys were talking about older people being scammed. And I've heard this before a few times. Mm-hmm. The older victims, well, it's probably dementia coming on, and that's why they were scammed. But the thing that bugs me is, number one, I'm older, but I don't have dementia, but people get to tag me with that. But it's not fair, number one. And number two, isn't that just a more empathetic way of victim shaming somebody that's older, to say, oh, poor person, they must be in cognitive decline?
So I think people misunderstand cognitive decline, right? This is how I like to describe it. And I've been to many elderly group where I gave a talk. And the best way for me to describe it is, imagine what your knees were like when you were 20 and 30 and 40, and what are they like now? Right?
They're great.
Okay.
Actually,
okay. But
yeah, I hear you. I've got relatives who've had knee surgery.
Okay, so they're okay, but you probably can't do things that you could do in your 30s in terms of running and like wear and tear, right? The same happens to our brain, right? And so there's nothing shameful about a cognitive decline. It happens to us all. Dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that, which is not really a cognitive decline, it's a different thing. A natural cognitive decline is one thing. It happens very slowly. It doesn't render you unable to make decisions, whereas dementia does if it's in the stages. The problem with dementia is often people notice the signs early on and hide them in front of family and friends. So by the time the family notices, they've already made some decisions, like they've been manipulated into some decisions that are not optimal. Cognitive decline just means that you're more likely, because your brain is aging, just as you're more likely to have a knee replacement at 60 rather than 20. I'm not saying that there's no people who don't need it at 20. My cousin's kid has had so many knee surgeries. He has very weak knees. He plays football and breaks something all the time. But there are anomalies, but generally wear and tear does its thing. And so I think scammers, my personal belief, because I don't know, I've never spoken to a scammer, but there is that kind of thing where there is that wear and tear. So you can be easily manipulated just because you have to take a little bit more time to think. And also, like elderly people have worked all of their lives, they have good 401ks, they are lucrative victims. So I think a lot of the times scammers go after them specifically because they have a disposable income they can access quickly, whereas you may not have it like in your 20s year. So so I think there is targeting component that, let's say if I target an 80-year-old, I can statistically would probably be higher probability that person could be easily manipulated versus a 40-year-old. Do you see what I mean? Because of some of the aging. Having said that, that doesn't go for every single person. It's just statistically the same as you're more likely to have a knee replacement or hip replacement in old age versus young age. So if you think about how scammers target, they look at the statistical probability of success for the scam, right? So I know it's really cold. If I was selling artificial hips, I wouldn't go to a school and start selling artificial hips in a high school. I would probably go somewhere else and
the senior centers.
It's pretty much the same. So think of the cognitive decline not as something shameful. It's literally wear and tear over cognitive functions, executive functions, and it happens. It happens. That doesn't render you. It still depends how much knowledge you have, how you make decisions, how impulsive you are. All of these things make a difference. Like you could be perfectly lucid at 100 and perfectly fine. You could get a dementia at 20. It's one of those things. But scammers typically, they like to target people that are vulnerable in terms of the easily manipulated. And that sadly happens to people also with learning disabilities. So not just the elderly. It's like whenever you have some kind of learning disability or cognitive disability, you're more easily manipulated. And so they look for victims like that. And so statistically, I think that's why they go towards elderly as well.
Well, my thing is, and maybe this is just self-protection, is that they target older people because of their bank accounts are a lot higher than somebody in their 20s. And the thing that's kind of scary now is, I mean, it's been going on, but the teenagers in the sextortion things, it's not just older people who are vulnerable. The younger people are as well. They think that they're talking to somebody real on the other end of the line. They get scammed just as easily. The Tinder swindler, it's everybody.
It's everybody. It's everybody. It's different scams that I think I was talking on another podcast about that. I was trying to cast my mind back. If somebody was trying to sextort me when I was 16, I didn't have any money, right? So is this also the fact that teenagers at this age now have a lot more valuable things? They have maybe more pocket money. If somebody wanted me to give them $2,000 at 16, I could barely ask my mom for an entrance to a club on a Saturday night, and I didn't drink anything. I could buy myself a Coke because I just didn't have that much disposable income at that age. So I think we also need to be thinking about how scammers target. They target where they can get money, right?
So they assume that the teenagers can get money somehow?
I think a lot of teenagers have a lot more things and access to money. Like I see, and I don't want to generalize, but I was in Sephora one day and there were two very young girls, I would say 11 or 12. One said to the other, "Oh yeah, this is a really cheap face cream. It's only $25. I don't even know that I was using a face cream at 12. Do you see what I mean? But they were shopping for skincare that I didn't start shopping for until I was in my 20s, maybe. And so I think there's definitely kids maybe have more disposable income that they can get. They're getting extorted for a reason, right? If they are not giving money, that scam wouldn't exist. So,
yeah. And here's one thing that I have thought about, and I don't know if it's true at all, but I'm just thinking, are the beginning scammers working the younger kids? I mean, are they cutting their teeth on these younger kids because these are fairly simple extortions, just picture sharing? You don't think they're that?
No, it's not actually a simple extortion. I think there's a lot, and I'm looking into that as a next white paper that I'm going to make available, because there are different types of scams, right? Like you have scams that cast a wide net, like phishing emails, and they'll get a little bit of money from a lot of people and still maybe end up. And there are these like bigger scams where they invest a lot into the victim to groom them to get a larger sum of money out of the victim. And I think like these extortion things, maybe the money sums are smaller. It starts maybe with like few $100s, then more, and they'll try and get as much out of the victim. but it's actually quite a manipulative. There's a lot of, it's quicker, but there's also grooming that goes into it. And I think just the same as I was speaking about the elderly people, younger people are vulnerable in different ways, right? So there's one evolutionary theory that talks about we are all born gullible, right? We are all born as children, we are naive. And there's a evolutionary reason for that, because in the olden days, parents didn't have nannies. Parents had to go and work in a field. So they had to be able to scare you to stay put all day when they went and worked. And they would have to say, you can't leave a house or a cave or wherever, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a reason why we are born. And then we accrue the experiences and become smarter. So children are more impulsive generally than older people. And as we age, we become a little bit more impulsive. So I would say the way these things are targeted, it really depends. Like they focus on your circumstances, on your existential and situational circumstances, your demographics, such as what would work for teenagers wouldn't work for you. If somebody asked you for like nude on Facebook.
No, I don't think so.
Exactly. So I think like you need to really see it that they know the customer, if I want to call it that, and they tailor make whatever to that person. So I think younger people are more open because they haven't had these negative experiences in life, right? So they don't even foresee it. Like they haven't had the trust betrayed yet. They're brand new, right? They're innocent. So the way they work children is different to, they don't have to maybe build that trust because you just don't expect it to happen, right? Because it's never happened to you, you've never been hurt. So like if there wasn't money in it, they probably wouldn't. They probably ask for small amounts of money, but they target wider range of people. They still do a lot of interesting things, such as they contact you on Facebook or Instagram or whatever platform, and they've already added a lot of your friends as their friends. So you think they're credible, they're just a friend of your friends. They still do some level of grooming and manipulation for you to trust them.
Because if my friend knows them, then they must be okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's never ending.
It's never ending.
I know that some of your more recent work is exploring AI and deepfakes. Can you tell us how that is changing the landscape here?
Yeah, I think with the generative AI, and we're seeing that now, right? Like, I think the boom in phishing emails, right? Whereas before we would get phishing emails all the time, they would maybe be poorly spelled. Now there's no reason for a phishing email to be poorly spelled because it can be beautifully written. Scammers can falsify documents to use as credibility. So we're seeing a lot more of AI-generated images of invoices, of bank statements they can create. If you know what you're doing, there are tools out there that you can just say, hey, create a website, code the website that looks like this and has all of these parameters. Those things are used in romance frauds, for example, without victim asking for that credibility checks. Scammers are offering. So one thing that I'm hearing over and over is that the scammer will say, hey, I'm stuck in this country, I can't access my bank account. Can you go into my bank account? Here are the credentials, transfer some money. And so you think that's a big gesture of trust between you two, right? Because you're in a relationship, right? Yeah. And it's very easy to create it with AI. Prior to generative AI, prior to these tools that were able to generate it very quickly, that would be costly to the scammer, right? They would have to hire somebody. They would have to purchase a domain. They would have to have a designer, have a developer code it, it would be costly. Now it's cheaper and easier and quicker. They could spin it up. Like I'm talking many, many, many years ago, even decades. Investment scams would create a fake website, right? So they would create a fake website, and then they would try and manage the victim to not report them to the police, because as soon as they were reported, the website would be taken down. Today, you can spin up another thing really quickly, and it's cheaper to make a website. It's cheaper to host a website. It's just easier. And then with all of that, if that wasn't bad enough, I think the deep fakes in terms of just like cloning voices, cloning videos, that actually messes with our perception of what the reality is, because we trust things we see and hear. And like how can you not trust it, right? So big companies have been defrauded by scammers engineering the video and voice of the CEO. And yeah.
Well, and not only that, but big tech is creating fake people as well.
Yes.
But that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
So tell us, before we take off here, I know you've got things to do. What are you doing now? What's up with you?
Yeah, I'm currently I realized that extortion affecting minors is a big thing. Right now, I'm hoping to dive a little bit more into how that happens and how scammers manipulate in that way, and maybe write something that people can read and have a look at in terms of that. I always like to take these techniques, break them down, make them easily understandable to people so that they know what's happening at each stage. And so sextortion is something that I'm looking at now. Sextortion is actually something I looked at in 2019 when those phishing emails sextorting people were circulating around. And I did an analysis of like 60 or 70 phishing emails. I broke them apart into components of how they persuade and stuff like that. So I'm hoping to do that for the newer ones that are targeting and just explain how they groom children. So that's my immediate next thing. I've just wrapped up my book, my second edition of my book, where I've added all of these newer scams and AI generated things and segments on pig butchering scams, more use cases and case studies and things like that. I've just wrapped up a chapter for a criminology textbook. Hopefully, those things are very slow, so that may come out maybe
in a while.
I haven't heard back. I think this is collecting material. So in the immediate future, I'm going to be focusing on writing something on sextortion scams.
Well, I hope I can have you back then, because that's just a form of romance scam too. And that's what I really want to focus on. I know that there's a gazillion scams out there, but I think where I can best help people is to just narrow my focus on that. So I'll be doing this. I do need to delve into that myself. So I hope you'll consider coming back one of these.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this time so much. I know that you're super busy.
Awesome.
Thanks, Martina. My thanks to Martina for helping us understand that scams don't exploit stupidity, they exploit human psychology. We talked about why Intelligent doesn't protect people from scams, how grooming begins long before money is ever requested, and how fear, love, and urgency can quietly shut down rational thinking, even in people who know better. In the next episode, Scammed Twice, The Machine Gets Its Cut, Part 1, we move from psychology to infrastructure. I'll explain what crypto ATMs are and why they have become one of the most dangerous points in the scam pipeline. This is the Romance Rebellion. Thanks for listening.